So welcome everyone to Reality Check with Rishi, and this is our podcast, a daily podcast that we have been running since coronavirus emerged as a big issue, and we have been talking about issues that affect you and me, where we discuss solutions and outcomes, a way for us to move forward. And we spent the last 8 to 10 weeks converging and talking about different issues as it pertains to coronavirus from the perspectives of healthcare professionals, from small businesses who are struggling to apply for stimulus funding, from Silicon Valley's technology standpoint, from the economy standpoint. We were talking about folks who are struggling to find jobs with layoffs and not having health insurance. We're talking about those types of challenges. And we were talking about moms and dads who were worried about college admission with the changing education system of online education and pass and fail versus grades, and no more standardized testing. So there was a lot of angst building up from a variety of different angles. And that was the topic of conversation over the last many weeks. And while America was reeling with one challenge, that was pretty amazing, or rather scary, in terms of how a new challenge emerged. And the only difference is that coronavirus just came out from nowhere. But the challenge that we are facing today, and the reason why we are all gathered here today, is because we are trying to figure out, how do we address an issue that has been burning for hundreds of years. Can you believe that? I just can't believe that. And so what we are trying to do is to bring an urgency to seeing how we can converge and get this resolved once and forever. So that's our purpose of getting together. And so today our topic is End Prejudice and Racism Deaths. And this is not a myth that we are talking about. These are the facts. You were hearing President Obama earlier. We were playing his speech. He was talking about it. And there are very specific stats to prove that. So we will not get into those types of data, but we really want to jump into what the issues are. So we intend to take some positive community action in the wake of George Floyd, and hopefully arrive through discussion, changes that can happen in our community and in our country. So here is what I observed with some of the recent happenings. So Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down while on a jog in Georgia. And then we had Breonna Taylor, who was shot by Louisville police while sleeping in her own bed. And Tony McDade was asked to not move, and he did not move, but he was still shot. So you can't walk while black when you're black. You can't jog while black. You can't drive while black. You can't sleep while you're black. And you cannot breathe. You cannot breathe when you're black. So yes, that's George Floyd. So George Floyd, 46 years old man, was a father of 2 children, a talented former high school and college athlete, and described by his friend as a gentle giant, a man with a quiet personality, but a beautiful spirit. He liked Latin music, and he would dance badly, and you know what? He would make people laugh. Before moving to Minneapolis, George lived in Texas, and he worked with the Resurrection Church to put on basketball games, barbecues, and baptisms. I mean, this man was a community man. He unfortunately perished and died 10 days ago at the hands of, rather, under the knees of a white police officer who kneeled on his neck for almost 9 minutes. And this is probably for the very first time we actually see a video that has come out. And the police officer ignored the pleas of bystanders and of Floyd himself. And that is haunting us now. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. The sound is reverberating across the country, within the youth, within anyone who has the heart. Our community, wants to stop breathing, because we really want to see some solution come out of this. So over the past 10 days, we have seen protests happening all over the nation and even throughout the world as people say, enough is enough. People of every shade and color, young and old, have together expressed their sorrow and anger to demand change. So violence and destruction is never the way to move forward, but I quote Dr. King, who said, "A riot is the language of the unheard. Violence can never be condoned, but leaders must listen to the voice of the people." So today, we will discuss how we as citizens, as neighbors, can make that change happen. The racism that has targeted African Americans and people of color for over 400 years cannot be allowed to persist, and we must stand together to begin to change this now. So my name is Rishi Kumar, and today we have with us, I'm very honored to host this set of panelists who people I respect a lot. So we have, firstly, former police officer in San Jose and Sunnyvale, and Sunnyvale's former vice mayor, Jim Davis, a very good friend of mine. And we have intersected many, many times in the past. We have had some phenomenal conversations on many aspects of crime, safety, community issues. And he's a 37-year veteran of Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department. And next up, we have former Undersheriff John Hirokawa. And John Hirokawa was also the captain of the city of Saratoga. And he's someone I've observed for many years now in action, and a man who operates in the most honorable manner. And in fact, he was running for county sheriff just a couple of years back. So we'll get some insights from John Hirokawa as well. And finally, we have a city council member from the city of Claremont, Jed Liano. So welcome all. Thank you so much for taking the time for joining us. And let's get the conversation started. So let's start with Jim, because Jim has a lot of experience, both on the policy side and also from the law enforcement side. And his perspectives will sort of get us going. So Jim, as a police officer and a council member and a vice mayor of Sunnyvale, what's your take on what is currently going on? What's your take on the protest? Let's start talking about that. All right, Jim, you probably need to unmute. Let me find you and let's see if I can unmute you. Thank you. Jed is on top of his game, always. Where is Jim?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Well, thank you very much for having me today, Rishi. It's a pleasure and a honor to be able to discuss this issue. And
he's muted.
Oh, you got muted again, Jim. Can you please unmute? Sorry.
unmuted again.
Yes, thank you.
The situation with George Floyd is untenable. The situation that occurred with him was just something that has caused outrage throughout the entire United States and Europe, for that matter. And the situation is not just George Floyd, but it also involves the Latino population, our Asian population, women, and the LGBTQ communities. All these communities have had their issues and their problems with being recognized in our communities and having their voices heard. Fortunately, in Santa Clara County, we are blessed with a number of very smart and topical police officers and police executives. In as much as I talk about Chief of San Jose Police Department, Eddie Garcia, who has made it a point that every time that there is a situation of violence or disturbance in his community, he reaches out and holds public meetings with the people that are interested in the topic, and they have a conversation. And he takes that back and institutes policies and procedures, that bring his law enforcement officers more in line. We also look at the city of Oakland, where Chief Kilpatrick was very active in her community and very involved with different aspects. And she too took responsibility in going out and meeting the public and talking about what was going on. There are other examples throughout the Bay Area. One that just touched my heart was in the city of Hayward, where the chief of police actually online knelt down with the protesters in honor of George Floyd and of the ability for people to hear the problems that are associated in our communities. And a number of his officers behind shields knelt down. That's the kind of responsible law enforcement action that we need to see more of. And we're very fortunate in regards to those kinds of things happening in our communities. Unfortunately, that doesn't carry throughout the entire United States. And Minneapolis is possibly the biggest example of how law enforcement has gone in a negative direction. So we're hoping the voices that are being heard now are, their comments are going to be taken to heart by our local, state, and national officials, and we start a conversation with people, because that's where the problems can really be resolved, not in legislation, not in council meetings, but for council members to go out and meet with their community, just as I know that you have done in your community in Saratoga, Rishi. And we need to have more of that. I'm reminded of one incident when I was a law enforcement officer. We had a man with a gun situation, and there was a gentleman inside of his home. He had 2 rifles and he was holding his family's hostage. And we had about 15 or 20 police officers surrounding the house and with their with long rifles out and with other guns, and we're trying to negotiate a settlement. And while we were out there on the perimeter, a lady from next door opened her front door and came out and said, what are you guys doing? And the officer who was next to me said, get back in the house and close the damn door. So we were able to resolve the situation, and we took the person into custody, and everybody started to leave. And I grabbed the officer and I says, you go over and knock on that door and you explain exactly what happened in this situation so that the people know why we were doing what we were doing. And later that afternoon, or that evening, he came back to me and he said, Jim, he says, thank you for bringing this to my attention. He says, I think I made a new friend. Those are the kinds of things that law enforcement needs to be more adept at doing, is stepping up and meeting the citizens, because we're all in this community. It's not just, you know, one race or one group. It's everybody together, and we all have similar incidents or interests. One of the things that was shocking to me was that I recently received some notifications on the email, and they listed a number of situations that had happened throughout the United States. And I'm here to tell you, in the last 96 hours, 312 police officers were injured, you know, in the riots, in the situations that came up. They weren't injured by people who wanted to make a legitimate stand and talk about the issues, but they were hit and they were attacked by people who were using the peaceful protest of our citizens to commit acts of violence. And then, you know, we have situations where they've broken into Target and they burned Target stores and looted them. And then this brings about a police response, because the police are responsible for protecting the lives and the property of our citizens. And what happens? We have officers with shields and helmets and, you know, tear gas and rubber bullets. And that only aggravates the situation. So the way we get to the problem, and it's a long-term solution, something that has to be started and continued, is we need to have dialogue with people. One other example I want to bring to your attention, I'm sure a lot of people know about, is the barbershop conferences that they have in Oakland, where varieties of people from in particular the Black community, get together with local leaders in a local barbershop, and they talk about things. And a lot of resolution to problems have occurred just because of those conversations. So conversation and talking to our public is where we can find an answer to these problems.
Absolutely. Jim, lots of great stories to share. Obviously, many years of you dealing with this issue and trying to arrive at solutions and resolution. So, you know, if I look back in terms of the last few days, this specifically did not quite, there was really not an intersect to Saratoga. And typically, the lot of the emails that we get for my city council, it actually comes related to local topics that are bothering people. But it is very interesting because I did receive a lot of emails from Saratoga residents, and primarily from a lot of the youth with the .edu as their email address, because I think they have been jarred into taking action. And the bottom line is, what they are stating is that we are all in this together. Like Jim said, we are all in this together, and we can all be allies with our Black neighbors, and we all want to stand up for them. And we did invite a few leaders from our community to join this panel discussion. For example, we invited Pastor Jethro Moore from the Antioch Baptist Church. We invited Council Member Larry Moody from East Palo Alto, a good friend of mine who I've known for many, many years. And in fact, with Larry Moody, we actually launched the Entrepreneurship Boot Camp for the city of East Palo Alto to provide the students there an opportunity to understand and have take a deep dive with respect to coding, programming, and the art of entrepreneurship. So these are things that we have been running in our city in Silicon Valley. But this particular challenge has really it's basically raised an urgency of what we need to do to address that. Let's go to Jed now. So Jed, from your standpoint, out there in Southern California, I think we would love to get your perspective into is this really a sort of systemic issue that you have seen over the years, or is this something that is just a question of discrimination that with some of the underlying problems? Would you like to comment on this, Jed?
I'd love to. And Rishi, I want to thank you for the invitation. And I want to thank my fellow panelists, John and Jim. It's great to be here with all of you. And before I answer your question and address that topic about systemic discrimination, I want to begin by just saying that this is the first step. Having these conversations where people of different professional backgrounds and ethnic and cultural backgrounds are able to talk about this problem, that will be the first way that we're able to begin to address and provide some connection between our institutions of government and the people who are governed by them. When I was first contacted by Rishi about talking about the protests on the street and Breonna and George and everything that has been happening with law enforcement, I immediately started to think about it is remarkably tragic what has happened, the seemingly disproportionate impact on life of Black men and women, and at times often seemed with impunity, where there seems to be a lack of accountability for the people who perpetuate this. I see this much deeper. We're not talking only about policing policy and criminal justice. We are actually right now talking about the consequences and the anger and frustration of a marginalized class of Americans. In the state of California, Black Americans only make up about 13% of our population, but they make up over 55% of our homeless population. We have a long history in the state of California of redlining, of literally crossing sections in communities that were less desirable for investment and were racially segregated by way of housing policy. For the last 10 years before the lead up to COVID, we had this unparalleled and unprecedented period of economic growth in the state of California. And despite that, despite wages almost going up 10%, for different categories of ethnic groups, African Americans only saw their wages go up 1.2% from the end of the Great Recession to the beginning of COVID. African Americans have a much lower rate of having health insurance. They have much lower academic outcomes. as a result of the poor funding of their school districts. And so I see this as a much deeper problem. People will not be subjugated. We are now seeing the result of when in multiple levels of policy, we fail to create an equitable system by which there's adequate opportunity and adequate and equitable outcomes. And so there's a way forward that we can think about this. We can think of our housing policy, our health policy, our educational policy, our economic development policy. We can think of all of those things holistically in a way to create a more equitable playing field so that a class of Americans do not feel subjugated and marginalized. And I think that the rage and the anger and frustration that we're seeing on the streets is a result of unfortunate incidents with police, but also so much more than just what is seemed to be discrimination and police brutality. And how do we go forward with that? I think there's a lot of ways, but the first step is like this: building trust. Jim brought up some excellent points about it's so much better to go out and just talk to people where they are, as opposed to bring it to the administrative body, bring it to the legislature, the council chamber. Go to where people are and talk to them there. But we have to make some strides in all other facets of policy. We have to make home ownership and affordable housing more likely for people of color. We have to make access to healthcare and access to education more likely for people of color. And if we can do more of those things, I think that we'll be able to address some of these issues more broadly.
Yeah, you make some really good points, Jed. And this reminds me of actually a newspaper cartoon that I actually posted on my Facebook wall. And there is this police officer sitting in a coffee shop, and we have a very little child sitting next to the police officer. It looked like a donut shop. And this police officer is talking to the child and looking to the child, and the child is very tiny. And the police officer says, son, what would you like to do when you grow up? And while he's sipping his coffee, and the little child says, I want to be alive. And that was a pretty stark story that this cartoon said. I mean, you know, Jed, you talk about lots of different issues right now. Yes, I agree that those are the issues, but the bigger issues of life and making sure that we don't have our Black brothers who are gunned down for the wrong reasons. And this is really the problem that we have to address. And it's not just one. It is going back many, many years, lots of different incidents, and we have to come to find answers to see how we can get there. And like we all agree, a good point for us is to get together and have these types of discussions and actually bring up questions that deserve talking about and that deserve to get a response from all of us in terms of convergence of ideas or philosophies, in terms of how we can move forward. And in fact, I'm not going to get into it at this particular discussion, but the youth movement, they are proposing very specific set of policies that our government should support. And this is something that we are looking at. And I presume they are reaching out and talking to local, state, and our federal government in terms of how some of these policies could be rolled out. And that is something, the drum is beating pretty hard, and we'll see if we have time to get into that. But here is what I would like to suggest to our gathered audience here. I really appreciate all of you taking the time. And we would love to get your perspective in this. And one way to do it is to put your questions on the chat window. And what we'll do is we'll pick the questions based upon the hierarchy of how we see it, right? So essentially, let's get the questions going on the chat window while I go to John. Let's go to John Hirokawa. And when I see what's going on in the country, and I can typically see things from both standpoint, which is, where my sense of how I operate with my elected leadership role You have to look at a challenge from both perspectives in order to come up with and make a decision on that. And this is how we go through public hearing processes. So when I see what's going on in the country, we see that the tensions are pretty high, and all it takes is like a very small trigger, and then it just like something happens. And the tensions are high on both sides. And to some extent, I think the relationship, the trust is broken right now. And it's stemming from that source of angst and frustration where there is a segment of society that may not have the voice, that is looking for expression, and they feel that it's reflecting perhaps on their own lives in terms of a voice not heard. It's hard to analyze this, and I guess we will go through the analysis and the soul searching as this evolves over time, and hopefully we can quiet this down and where we actually come up with resolutions and solutions. But John, how do you build the relationship? Let's talk about relationship. I mean, you have served for many, many years here in Saratoga and in Santa Clara County. How do you establish relationship between law enforcement and the community?
Well, first off, Councilmember Kumar, thank you for inviting me and my other panelists, Jeb and James. So let's start with March of 1991, Rodney King. So how far have we come? Back then, you had a pretty large segment of our community, African Americans, who were saying their voices weren't being heard. 1991. Now we're in 2020. And that's going back to 91. You got Oscar Grant. You got Freddie Brown. I mean, you got multiple other incidences between the two dates, between Mr. Floyd and Rodney King. So Jeb talked about accountability and trust. That's number one. And so if communities don't feel that they're being heard, or minority communities, ethnic communities are feeling they're not being heard or don't have a voice, what else do you expect? Now, law enforcement officers, and I was in the sheriff's office for 37 years, we're supposed to be trained. We're supposed to be disciplined in regards to our actions, no matter what happens. You're supposed to be able to control those things. But there is a definite, and we think we're in California, the melting pot of the United States. What's the disproportionality of minorities in our state, California state prisons, the representation? Overwhelmingly African Americans and Latinos. Why is that? That comes down to the laws we passed in regards to drug, gangs. Those, I believe, a lot of those legislations were passed. And I'm not going to say those legislatures were biased, but I believe it was also knee-jerk reactions until what were the trends for that particular time when they were passing drugs on crack cocaine, methamphetamine. Now we got fentanyl and opiates. You have to think about, as you apply these laws, as you create these laws, what is the down the road impact on those communities? And is it the right course of action to incarcerate, especially our young African American and Latino population? Is that what we really want to do? So to build trust, law enforcement agencies, as we were dealing with Michael Tyree, the inmate that was killed in the Santa Clara County Jail, what came forward was implicit training, body cameras, which were great. But the third component that I believe most agencies across the nation, including California, has been the call for an independent citizens auditor. So that police chief, that sheriff, it's a little bit harder because it's elected. That department's held and accountable to an independent body that reviews and looks at the investigation to determine what went wrong, how it needs to be improved, and hold those officers and deputies accountable. And I think Jeb talked about trust and accountability. How do you have that when internally the office is doing it? Now you do have your district attorney, and luckily And back in Minneapolis, they decided to go ahead and charge those officers in regards to Mr. Floyd. But unless the community has trust in the justice system and they don't feel left out in regards to law enforcement, I don't think we move forward. They have to have trust in the system. They have to know people are going to be held accountable. And the people and the leaders and the people who are providing for that department, they're going to be held accountable. So it's not just the chief of police. Well, except for in Louisville, they just fired the Louisville police chief for his officers for their conduct. And it was and so unless you have, I believe, unless you have some type of independent body of community members who can evaluate the situation and the community has trust in them, that they will hold people accountable at all levels. I think we'd still deal with these as all the way back to Rodney King. I think we still continue down this road. Implicit bias training, that's, for me, it's good training. But what happens if we have a racist cop? And I'm gonna say there are racist cops out there. But you do the implicit bias training, I'm not too sure what a 8 to 10 hour course is gonna change this person from being a racist. It may affect some, but the true racist cop, it's not going to affect. So how do you weed those people out? Well, one, you start off with hiring, training, but then you got to hold them accountable. And that body should be able to weed those people out. I'm not going to weed out everybody, but unless the community has trust, I don't know how we move forward.
You know, John, you make some excellent points, but, you know, as we discuss this, you know, there is a sense of discomfort that I have within me, which I've never had these past many weeks talking about coronavirus. I mean, with coronavirus, there was a huge amount of angst and stress that we all felt. And in this particular case, there is a lot of sadness that we all experience, but also there is discomfort to talk about this type of issue because, you know, many of us are not on the same page. Like you just said, John, you know, you said that there are some police officers who are exhibiting racism, and there is a sense of discomfort in us talking about it. But based on what you were saying, John, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the policy recommendations that are being made, and I'll touch upon it very briefly. And I would love to get your comments down the road as we go through this discussion about these three areas. So let me just touch upon it. And what we'll do is we'll go to questions next, just to make it an interactive discussion. And I invite all of you who have joined us to please turn on your videos. And also you will have to unmute yourself because we muted everybody at the start of this program. So unmute yourself and turn on your videos so that we can actually see you. That makes it for a much better discussion. So here are a couple suggestions that have been made. And we talk about redirecting police funding. And a stat that came out was that the average police recruit spends 58 hours learning how to school, 58 hours, learning how to shoot, 58 hours learning how to shoot, and only 8 hours learning how to de-escalate, 8 hours learning how to de-escalate. And there is talk about engaging a lot of other sources to go and help with the de-escalation process. You know, bringing not just police officers to the scene, but also a wide variety of groups to help out with that. And, you know, if you go to my website, rishikumar.com/Black Lives Matter, you know, we have a newsletter there. We call it, this newsletter is called the Anti-Racism Resources. And you will find lots of great information there in terms of organizations to follow on social media, or if you're looking at reading material, we have links into the New York Times reading material, things like that. So go and take a look at that. I will text the link on the chat window. Here is something else that was suggested: to abolish legislative police protections. So that is, you know, it's, I don't know which group it is, but this was a common thread amongst many emails that I received. And finally, the third proposal is to demilitarize the police. So this is what we are talking about. But let's hold that, let's table that, and let's go to Timothy Meneses. Timothy, would you like to jump in and ask your question?
Yep. So my question was just regarding, like, I have a lot of friends, and you could say their political views are different from mine. And I always try to be this kind of common ground person and someone that initiates conversation, but they're always kind of stubborn to engage in that conversation. I don't know why. But I guess, how can I make that easier for them to see the value in creating that peaceful discourse?
Very good question. And our panelists, anybody can jump in and chime in, so please feel free.
Rishi?
Yes, go ahead, Jim.
Am I on? Yeah. I thank you very much for your comments. And the last 6 years that I served with the police department, I was as a neighborhood resource officer. And my job was to deal with issues that surround the school. And what I found was being able to talk one-on-one with young people and listen to what they were saying went a long way to solving some of the problems. But there are other organizations that we have in the county that are very helpful in regards to just the kind of issue that you're talking about. And I refer you to Fresh Lifelines for Youth, or FLY. And they deal with the kinds of problems from a law enforcement perspective, a community perspective, an educational perspective. And they are very good at opening up conversations and getting people to talk about all the issues that you're concerned about.
Thank you, Jim. Let's go to, okay, let me just scroll back up. Let's go to Ambika Ramadurai. Ambika, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. So my question is, I want to be more involved and be able to talk to people and advocate, but I'm not allowed to go to any of the protests or rallies. And so what are ways I can advocate and talk to people apart from social media?
Yeah, so Ambika, you know, I think social media is obviously a great way for us to express our voice, and probably the easiest way. And I see a lot of youth like you who are making flyers and expressing the voice. In fact, we have a summer internship program that we run, and we have quite a few high school and college students that have joined. And this is bothering them quite a bit because we can see so many flyers and messages and ideas being churned out. So that's exactly what you are probably also doing. But how can we go beyond that? How can we go beyond that? And one way you could do it is to raise money for nonprofits that are working towards this particular objective. So the anti-racism resources link that you will find on my website, rishikumar.com/Black Lives Matter, you will find lots of groups that you can donate to. You will also find lots of recommendations in terms of what action you can take. So I think social media is kind of like the easy thing to do, but I do believe we have to do a lot more. And participating in like marches, peaceful marches, and having conversations with your friends and trying to figure out, you know, what you can do. And here is the one suggestion which I always make with absolutely anything that we do. You know, what is that one thing that you would like to do? Think through that. Do some reading, figure out what you can do. Perhaps it's raising money for a nonprofit that will help this particular issue. And then what you have to do is take that very first step. Take that first dollar, make that first dollar from somewhere, see how you can get that contribution and direct it to the nonprofit. And then you don't give up, because that very first step that you took with the first dollar will become your launching pad to a lot more ideas. If you take that first step, I guarantee you this, Ambika, you will realize a lot more opportunities, a lot more potential, because you will figure out a way to move forward. Take that first step. Social media is the easy way to do things, but there's a lot more things that we can do. Great question, Ambika. Let's go to...
You mind if I jump in? You mind if I jump in and add something for Ambika? Because Ambika, I'm really glad to see you on here. And you're right. With COVID, social media is kind of dominating our activity right now. And it's true that there's a lot of angst about participating in public places with COVID. So totally think that you're on the right track. One thing that I'm really glad to see that you're involved in is you're engaging with Rishi, who is a local elected official, and he's running for Congress. We have to reinforce to young people the importance of local election and down ballot campaigns and races. You know, when we think about how policing policy is made, it's made at a community level. You know, your chief of police in small towns like mine in Claremont is typically hired by the city council. And so when you want to make an impact on how law enforcement is carried out in your community, the biggest thing you can do is, number one, you can find out who your city council members are. And then you can find out what are their positions on these law enforcement issues. Ask them, they'll talk to you. And a lot of times, you know, Rishi, when we ran for council, a lot of times we have these also on the ballot, these superior court judges. And a lot of times people just pass right through that. The race for district attorney and judges, those are the people deciding the cases that are making people furious. Those are the most important elections, and no one sometimes pays attention to them. So among you and your friends, you can get involved in these judge races, these council races, and these district attorney races and city and county attorney races. Those are who are impacting those issues the most.
Thank you. Thank you, Jed. That was really good. Let's go to Tanvi Chopra. And Tanvi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So just wanted to start off and say this is great conversations. These conversations are what is going to make changes. So I had two questions. So there's a bill currently in place that is ending immunity agreements for law enforcement. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on if that's feasible and what we have to do in order to make that feasible. And then my second question is really directed to Ed. I really would love to hear his opinions on abolishing prison systems. Prison systems are violent institutions that reproduce violence. And in order to change, we must ask these essential questions on how no body is disposable. How do we fight this violence? What does it mean to fight for a world where we don't have to worry about violence?
Jed,
Yeah, that's the end of my questions.
Thank you, Tanvi. Good question. And Jed, would you like to take that question? It was specific.
I'd be happy to. And, you know, I want to tell you that that a lot of the points that are made about demilitarizing police and making police budget allocations more in line with the needs of the community, I'm sympathetic to and agree with a lot of that. I do believe, frankly, though, if you want police departments that are well-trained and have systems of accountability, defunding them is not the way to get there. It's just not. I mean, if we want to have systems in place where we have really good personnel and they get excellent top of the line training, I don't think defunding police departments is going to get us to that position. With regard to prison systems, my opinion is that I believe that we should pursue avenues of rehabilitation. There were some laws that eliminated incarceratory penalties for misdemeanors, like AB 109 is one of them. But the thing is, AB 109 mandated the release of a lot of low-level offenders, but at the same time, communities were not given the resources to help rehabilitate and help acclimate those people back into the communities. It was just basically a release program on some level. I think it would have been a lot more successful if we had more resources to help people when they were released to pursue education and job training. And so I think we should pursue rehabilitation, but it has to be attached to the adequate training and opportunities. And of course that requires funding.
And Jed makes some excellent points with this. And typically, Tanvi, when you look at these types of issues that emerge, you know, the prison system, you know, what really happened in California over time was our prison systems filled up. And then Governor Brown many years back was essentially asked that, hey, you know, either you build more prisons or you have to figure out a better plan. And that's when we rolled out Prop 47 to treat our criminals a lot more leniently. And, I don't think so we approached the problem from a root cause analysis and trying to really address it, right? Because what happened was the crime seemingly went up through the roof in every city in California after Prop 47. But there are other ways to look at the problem and finding solutions. And how do you do that? So for example, if you can create opportunities, right? Vocational education. You look at the amount of money we spend on education in the state of California, and the numbers are about like, let's say $14,000 for per child in the state of California versus spending about $50,000 for a prisoner in the California prison system. And this is a number that I'm not making up, but this is a number that I've heard from a state senator, and he's quoted it many, many times. And that's the stark reality of what we are dealing with, right? So I think we need to spend on education. California is the 46th in terms of our education system in the country, number 46. And I think we can make that better. We need to create opportunities. We need to create vocational education. Like Jed was referencing, there are very specific challenges that some of the underserved communities go through. And we have to create opportunities for them. And it all comes from education. Like coming from India, I think education is sort of like the one that gets the most priority compared to a lot of other areas like food and housing, for example, right? It's pretty interesting, the set of priorities that we have. And California needs to completely focus upon a priority to build an educational network, which is not just the 9 UCs that we have. We have to create vocational education. And what are we talking about? We're talking about education for social media, because our high-tech companies here, there are high-tech companies all across California, and they need the skills. And it doesn't mean that you have to go through a 4-year college education. When you look at an area like social media, I think when kids are born in this country, they're actually breathing the social media air. They really understand it so well. And so that's the expertise we need to build and encourage so that they will find a place for themselves in the economy. Those are the types of opportunities we need to create and prevent the prison system from getting overloaded like what we have been experiencing. It's all about basically creating prosperity. When you look at the challenge we have, and some of our presidential candidates talk about it quite a bit, the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows year to year. And this is why we are seeing a revolution. We have one of the presidential candidates who always talks about there is a revolution happening on the streets, and it's basically tied into that. We have to create opportunities for every American, for every underserved community member of our society, and that's the only way we can move forward. I would like to go to, let's
Rishi,
see.
I'd like to comment about
Please go ahead.
Kevin, your comments. Governor Brown, so you did touch on, the overcrowding of the prisons, especially for dealing with the mentally ill and the medical inmates, state prison inmates, was overwhelming the state prisons. The state legislators passed where they were no longer going to fund and build more additional prisons. And now the state, and at that point, the state, and we go back to Governor Duke Majan, the state was now faced, Governor Brown was now faced with a federal consent decree that he inherited that federal consent decree when the judge was saying, you need to reduce your population in the state prisons. So what does Brown do? He can't build more. So what's the alternative? You can't build more prisons. So what's the alternative? So he did a paradigm shift. Well, maybe I could release the low level offenders. Now they are felons. And that was AB 109 that Jeb had referred to. Now what Brown did, and I'm not going to say, and I think Jeb has us to a certain point. What Brown did was take money earmarked for the prisons, for the housing of inmates, and then moved it to the 58 local counties to deal with the release of those AB 109 inmates. Now, let's just say, I'm not going to say that all those inmates got released and nobody ever committed any additional crimes. That would be ludicrous to say that. But I do believe that the statistics now say from that experiment, the 109, at first law enforcement was attacking 109, especially the police chiefs, that the property crimes had skyrocketed. But I think after 109 had been in place for about 3-4 years, the real tale came out that it had a minor impact on the number of recidivism for that inmate population. Now, I agree with Jeb. There was funding, and this county received tens of millions of dollars to receive those inmates, as with other counties. But it wasn't enough. Okay, it wasn't enough. But he had to start, Governor Brown had to start somewhere. He had to start somewhere. And then I'm going to bring up, I thought in the last election in 2018, there was a state bill, no bail. The California residents voted to do away with bail. Okay. Now, today I'm still reading the papers where, because of the COVID-19, the Santa Clara County jail population went from about 3,500, it's down to 2,200 because there's zero bail associated now with misdemeanors. But I thought we had voted on that 2 years prior. And so now the information, the analysis is going to have to be done because of the COVID-19. And it's not just Santa Clara County, it's all the counties. Alameda County was at a population of 3,700. So they've all dropped their populations at about anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 inmates. So now the experiment's going to be, now what I'm going to say, some of those people who were released because there's no bail on misdemeanors are going to reoffend while they're out. But then I think the jury's not in yet in regards to, with this system of no bail on misdemeanors, is there going to be a huge spike, or was there a huge spike in regards to those people being out on those conditions and reoffending? And there have been examples that have been pointed out, but I believe at this point I'm only hearing anecdotal, small numbers in regards to that. So the question is still, are we going to hold, there's no, the state prisons and your county jail, it's a money pit, a money pit. So should we be putting that money into, as Jed has asked for, reforming them, rehabilitation, and putting that money into education versus housing inmates in the state prison and local jails? And I think that needs to be discussed in regards to how we move forward as a community and society.
Great response, John. And I can clearly sense that we are all thinking. These are very, very introspective questions that are popping out of people's minds, and that is making each of us think through, and hopefully we'll arrive at some conclusions as we get through this one. But I can tell you one thing, that this is only a start, because we are almost at the top of an hour and we haven't quite done anything yet, because there is so much to talk about. There is so much to talk about. So, I don't want to, let's see. We have Suzanne Regal. And Suzanne, I didn't quite understand your question, but I would love to see if you would like to chime in and share your questions, or perhaps you have a perspective for everybody here.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for joining in.
All right. I grew up in the state of in Florida until I was an adult, and I came out here because I became a physician, and I was in obstetrics and gynecology for 30 years at the Center for Life. And what I noticed is that there were no Blacks in any of the schools I attended, none in the medical school, none in any of the fields. And I think it was because of the prejudice against Blacks, and Blacks having so few things that they were able to use to get their education. The good news is when I go back for reunions, now the Blacks are there in the medical school. But I don't know of where any Blacks live. I live in West San Jose, and the only place that I've ever heard Blacks living is East Palo Alto. I don't know. You're in Saratoga. I'm not aware of any Blacks live in Saratoga. So what I would like to see happen is that we would have some community meetings where we would invite Blacks to be guests with us and discuss some issues that we have in common, that we could talk together and see what their ideas are.
Absolutely. Susan, that's a very good suggestion, and that's exactly what we intend to do. And I was just looking up the percentage of our Black population in America, and it's about 14% of the total US population. So the question, Suzanne, do we have Black people here in Saratoga? Of course. I mean, we have Black people, and we have students in our elementary schools. And in fact, we had a youth commission interview on Wednesday, and we selected a Black student to be on our youth commission. So the answer is yes, but you're right. I think we have a larger population in a city like East Palo Alto. But you make some great suggestions, Suzanne. So please keep it coming at us. Let's go to Sachin. And Sachin, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? And let me do a time check with our panelists. Do you have a hard stop where you need to leave? But I'm thinking we can go at least for 30 more minutes because there is so much to talk about. Okay, good. I see thumbs up from everybody. Let's keep going because this is an expression. Everybody's found a forum to express. So let's hear these voices. Go ahead, Sachin.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
So because of social media, I was able to see videos of protests, violent and non-violent. So I was just wondering, is there any way in the future, right, to not predict, but like just be able to like de-escalate the situation so that more rioting and looting doesn't happen?
So I've had many discussions about this with a lot of folks. And, I think this is the burning question with a lot of people. And we're all figuring out, how to stop the destruction, how to stop the violence. I mean, this is no way for us to move forward or converge upon some sort of common understanding. But I would love to have Jim Davis talk about this one.
Well, thank you, Rishi. It's something that's particularly of interest to me. The problem that we're having with the violence in the different protests, the protesters, the people who organize the peaceful protests, are there and do participate in a peaceful manner. The problem that we're seeing is that there are people from outside their group who are taking advantage of the protesting opportunity to come in and create violent situations. So it's not the protest in San Jose. We have a protest here in Sunnyvale starting tomorrow, and Mountain View's having one today. The people who are organizing it are good people who are trying to bring forward excellent recommendations. But we know from experiences in Oakland and San Francisco and Hayward and Palo Alto, there are people that come to and join in that for the particular purpose of creating violence. And so we've got to try to find a way to identify those people ahead of time and meet them head on. Because otherwise, what happens is we see the terrible situations that happen, such as the owner of the jewelry store in San Jose, Black gentleman, had his windows broken and tens of thousands of dollars of jewelry stolen by people. Weren't stolen by the people that were on the front lines yelling and asking for a voice. They were stolen by people who were particularly there for criminal activity.
And I would love to see, if Jed or John would like to also make a comment on this.
So having you got to build relationships prior to the fire being lit. And so it's incumbent on city officials, your law enforcement, to have those relationships, especially with the multiple different diverse communities that we serve here, and have those contacts in place when something controversial does come up, as Mr. Floyd. And then so from that, you build your base in regards to how you deal with those protesting. Now, as Jim said, you're going to have outside groups. We had a pretty controversial protest going on at the time when General Colin Powell came to talk at the Deanne's Flint Center. And so there was an active protest then, and it became violent. But that's where your training in regards to your staff, line staff and their supervisors, and the clear and direct orders from the higher ups, the administration, about how they will conduct themselves. You try to separate the ones that are trying to antagonize and trying to attack even the deputies or the officers on the line, trying to antagonize them to take some type of violent action, but they have to remain disciplined. And so you do it in an orderly way. You use as the least amount of force necessary, and you try to separate those individuals of those groups from the rest of the group and allow the rest of the groups to peacefully demonstrate. Now, when the crowds get large, and we had about, I think, about 500-600 out at De Anza, but when the crowds get that size and that large, it becomes more difficult. But as long as, and what I'm seeing though, across the country, there's been a lack of control and discipline by the line officers and their supervisors about how they've dealt with some of those protesters. And so there's where you have, let's just say, chaos. Things get out of control. And so, but building those relationships at the very beginning is one of the keys to try to minimize the amount of violence and looting.
Great point, John. Jed, you want to add something to this?
My colleagues said it. They're good. Nothing to add.
Jed is one of the few politicians who doesn't like to speak just for the sake of speaking, I guess. So let's go to Christine Lau. Christine has a great question.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for hosting this. This is great. My question is, what can a regular citizen who is not in a government position do to help increase accountability on law enforcement? Like Jed mentioned earlier, the only thing I can think of is like voting, and hopefully like participate in the local elections, and hopefully we vote, responsible people, who will have some impact on, hiring and, creating policies. But I'm wondering if there's anything else we can do. It feels like, with technology, regular citizens have been able to share videos of injustices, and that's one thing. But it feels like even when they're charged, sometimes, a lot of times they get acquitted and they don't get convicted. So it seems like, when it gets to that level, like systemic racism, like you can do your part, but there are so many other parties, and you never know, like, if they will be held accountable. So that was my question.
Christine, I really appreciate you joining in today and asking your question. And this is what you are doing today is you're demonstrating engagement, and that is where it all begins. And what I suggest to the youth of our country is to basically get engaged with our governance model. Chime in, speak up, and in fact, make sure you vote. So when you look at elections that happen in this country, only at this point, I'm going to say this, right, because there is so much outrage that our youth are feeling today. There is outrage, there is angst, and the feelings are just very emotional, and it's all popping out sometimes on the street, right? But, it makes a lot of sense to create a pattern, for example, of regular engagement. What does that mean? It means casting your vote, as simple as that. I think a lot of the youth of our country do not believe in that model. So I've heard stats that only 19% of our youth end up voting. And that has to change because, this is the reason why, because we are not making the right political choices is the reason why we have a situation like this in the country. When you look at big money in politics, how it is dominating, how it's subverting the agenda of the common man, the voices have been stifled. This is what is wrong. And where does it begin? It begins from you and me. We need to step up, take charge, and express our voice. And that is probably a very, very important thing for each of us to do. And it doesn't mean that you start voting when you turn 40 or when you have a family or when you have your first child. It means you start voting from the day you get registered to vote. When you get registered to vote, that very first election, you have to participate and make it a best practice. Now, also to address your question on accountability on law and enforcement, bring up these ideas to city council. I mean, how many times do I hear from our youth? Not a whole lot. I mean, we heard it we were doing a tobacco law. We were talking about, what is that? There were a few regulations. We actually banned vaping in Saratoga. And that was the point of time we heard a few of our youth jumping in and talking about it. We did a law on gun control, and that's when we heard a few things. But I think I largely see a youth community that is not very engaged. And I'm just stating a fact here. We need to see a lot more of you jump in and express your voice and talk about accountability. For example, what we did in the city of Saratoga. So let me say this, right? People have asked me questions. Is there a problem in Saratoga or where we live? And for the most part, there is no problem. I mean, I tell people, like, I don't see any problem happening because we have outsourced our police department, our sheriff to the Santa Clara County Sheriff, and they are doing a phenomenal job. I mean, John Hirokawa was actually the captain many years back, and today we have Captain Urena, and they do some phenomenal jobs. But what we did as city council members, we actually recommended getting body cams. Little things like that, right, will sort of help. Or if we find a need for training and things like that, then we sort of make that recommendation. But why isn't the youth of our country the eyes and ears of our policymakers? And you are basically showing us the way. I would love to see that. But anyway, let's go to the rest of our panel and see what else they would like to share.
Rishi, if I can step in.
Please.
Okay, I'm sorry. The youth, what I recommend is that you look at the agendas for the different city council meetings. A lot of city council meetings are really boring, but there are topics that come up that are very relevant. The other thing is that there's a open mic provision at each city council where citizens can come up and express their views and let the council know what's happening. In the city of Sunnyvale, and I'm sure in other cities, we have a youth commission, where you can apply and become a part of that. And they make recommendations to the city council. Above and beyond that and voting, join other organizations. Be a part of the NAACP. NAACP is the National Association for Colored People, but they also have Latino members and Indian members and white members that participate in their activities. And also, be active with the ACLU. They have a lot of community groups where they get feedback from people. And this might be an excellent way for young people to express their views and in an audience that is going to listen to them.
Right. Good points, Jim. So let's keep going because we have, let's say another 20 minutes. Let's try to get through all the questions we have here. And so let's go to Jeff Schwartz. Jeff, would you please unmute yourself and chime in? Sounds like
yes.
You have...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First, I want to say hello to John Hirokawa. I haven't seen him for a while, but I worked with John at the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office. I did some consulting and some volunteering there. And John is exactly the kind of police administrator that communities need and want and should have. John was absolutely great. So I hope people will listen carefully to John's views on this. The police question is broad and deep, and now it's getting a lot of attention, but there is no one or two or three answers. If you look at the militarization of police, if you look at the police move towards a warrior culture, if you then add in some police who are angry, not as stable as we would hope, some who are racist, that's enough to stir the witch's brew, and then you get very bad results. There are, I think, 28 cities of the 100 largest cities in the country have banned chokeholds. That means that 72 have not. So there are a lot of moves that communities could take, but they stop short. There's lots of work to be done on police training, on other areas, but the police culture is not what we need if it is going to be protect and serve. It's not close. I've worked with police and corrections for over 40 years, and we aren't close. In the late 60s and early 70s, well, in the mid 60s and before, all police were male. It wasn't until late 60s that women began to be integrated into police departments. We now have lots of evidence that female police officers are less violent, better at de-escalation than male. So one thing we could do is, let's do it the other way around. Let's make a requirement that all police be female, and then we can slowly integrate some males into the system. That would help. The prison and jail situation, our prison and jail situation is basically wrong and sick, and there are no short fixes, quick fixes. By the way, Nebraska, the stuff about worrying about what'll happen with no bail, forget about it, to use a New Jersey expression. Nebraska is the only state in the country that's had no bail by law. By the way, no private prisons, no inmates could be sent to private prisons in Nebraska. They've done just fine without it. They've not had the prison explosion of prison growth the rest of the country has had. So there are things we could do. Mostly, we should look to Europe and other countries where prison terms are short, prisoners are reintegrated into the community. It's less expensive, and recidivism is a small fraction of what we have. Now, they don't have our gun culture. They don't have some of our problems, but they do a far better job. That's an area where we might need to just dynamite it and start over. Thank you, Rishi.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, Jeff. Jeff is a longtime activist in Saratoga, and he takes charge on issues, and he's a man I respect a lot for his commitment to public service, because he is a man of action. Let's go to Gary Smith. Gary Smith, would you like to please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, thank you for hosting the meeting this evening. Try to keep my questions simple and directed primarily to Honorable John Hirakawa. I heard him speak when he was running for office a couple of years ago, and one of the points he brought out was when he would arrest someone, he would treat them with dignity. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. And I just wanted to ask him, and I'm sure it would be true with Jim Davis or Jeb, you know, was it just his family upbringing that developed that skill, or and what, you know, what the opposite, what went wrong in Minnesota? Was it that man's just his lack of upbringing? That's basically my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gary. I think a lot of it had to do with my upbringing and my parents and the environment. And then comes the training from the law enforcement and my peers and the people I work for, my supervisors, administrators I work with in the sheriff's office. I think they kind of, you know, mentored me and got me on the right track in regards to that. And I credit a lot of people. So in Minneapolis, you know, so Dr. Schwartz, he's the use of force expert, so I can never argue with the doctor. But the fact of the matter is, I believe it's coming out that Mr. Floyd died of some type of, or most likely of what we call positional asphyxiation. And that has been known. This type of death, when you handcuff an arrestee behind the back and you place them on the ground. This has been an ongoing issue, I don't know, 2 decades maybe. And for me to see somebody kneel on somebody's neck on the ground, and he says he can't breathe, that's a clear case of positional asphyxiation. I mean, so I have no answers to why, based on today and the training that I've received and what I've seen over 2 decades. you have to guard against that. And so why didn't he pick him up, make sure he's breathing, put him on his side, is beyond me. So I just don't know. It's hard for me to say what the intent was. I'm also kind of wondering how come nobody else stepped in, hearing him saying he can't breathe. That's where the other officers have to step in and say, and take control. When somebody, I've seen it even in my career, and I'm saying good cops, good deputies, become emotional in the time, and especially after a pursuit. And then once the pursuit stops, you go in and try to grab the guy, get him out of the car. Emotions are high, tensions are high. And a lot of times those emotions, even though as much training as we give them, overtake them. And that's where somebody, especially that's why we have to have good supervisors, good sergeants in the field who then step in and take control and intervene. I've done that. I've seen good supervisors done it. Hey, step aside, you take control. So again, I can't explain what happened. I just know that I can't why 2 decades positional asphyxiation has been an issue, and why this person had to die in that situation that way. So it's beyond me. But I'm going to going back to use of force, talked about de-escalation. So everybody's asking, what can we do, even if you live in Saratoga? So I haven't seen where, even the sheriff's office has updated their use of force for patrol, for the street deputies. Dr. Schwartz was integrated. He was part of the total revamping of the use of force in the jails, in these jails. But I don't believe they made the connection that, patrol has a different general order, different guidelines, policies on their use of force. And one of my things was in regards to use of force, escalation of force, especially in regards to use of firearms. LA County, of all places, LA County learned through their missteps. In the policy, there needs to be, in the policy, the officer has to explain, once you have to put it pen to paper, you have to go through, explain what steps you took before you used a firearm, what steps you took to de-escalate the situation before using a firearm. That's specifically written in their policy. And a lot of street police agencies in sheriff's office don't have that written in their policy to force upon those deputies and police officers out in the street. You better be aware, you're going to have to explain as you're going through the use of force continuum, you better be able to explain what steps you took before pulling that trigger or before getting to that point, or using a taser, using your ASP, those kind of things. Those things need to be put into those policies, and those are simple fixes. Now, most law enforcement officers believe that they have to make split-second decisions, but if you make them think about it before they have to do it, it's in the back of their mind. And I'm telling you, through training and policy enhancements, they'll think about it. They'll think about it. So that's just part of some of the solutions, I think.
Thanks for setting such a great example. Thank you.
Excellent ideas, John. Go ahead, Jim.
What totally incenses me about the George Floyd incident was that you had an officer there who was taking a person into custody. He had him under control. He had the man handcuffed. He had a police car immediately available to put that man in. And 3 other officers, and he did absolutely nothing for 9 minutes. And I truly hope that they feel the full weight of justice in Minnesota through the court system for what they did. It was just unexcusable on any level.
Thank you.
I agree, Jim.
Rishi, can I just jump in and piggyback on one thing John mentioned? John was explaining this is the policy in LA County, and I want to just reiterate to everybody listening, I think you're hearing a common theme here that keeps coming up again, which is engagement in local government. Wherever you live, in city, or if you live in a city with city police, or if you live in a city that is county sheriff, that's not the department's policy. That's your policy. You're the voters. So go and ask either your sheriff or your police chief, what is our policy? And if you don't like it, go say, I don't like this, and let's talk about it. And you are the ones who have the right to ask and drive that conversation. The policy doesn't belong buried in the books on a shelf. This is the time now to talk about it. And if you have interest in it, go inquire, and they'll give you an answer. By law, they're required to give that to you.
Yeah, great point, Jed. It's, we have to demonstrate engagement, and this is the perfect time to do it. We see a lot of youth who are participating today, but it shouldn't stop here. Do not stop. In a few weeks, perhaps, America might come back to normalcy, but it will never be normal because in our minds, we have to go and take action. So, there was something I wanted to add, but it escapes me now. So let's go to Sean Penna. Sean has a great question here. Oh, I did want to add that, when you look at some of the suggestions we heard was with respect to, what's happening in different parts of our country, the state, look at the best practices. For example, when you look at Germany, every bullet, they do some sort of investigation. And whenever the bullet is launched, they do a very thorough investigation of what exactly happened. These are very simple things that will sort of orient a proper behavior in our public safety personnel. They're obviously under a lot of stress. And like was pointed out, when they go through a car chase, their tempers are pretty frayed by the time they get out of the car, right? But I think we need to put the brakes on it with some sort of training. And I'll give you an example. For example, I spent many years in IBM, and we were constantly being trained to exhibit a certain type of behavior. And what was pretty clear is if you didn't comply with the culture that was established, you're not really playing ball with the rest of the IBM family. And chances are it will be noticed and it will be brought to attention. So that was pretty clear. This was a big giant of a company, and we sort of operated in a very specific framework, and that kind of kept things in sync. And this is what needs to happen. We need to have education. We need to define a tight culture, the operating framework of how we want to see this playing out in America that will prevent these types of situations again. Look at the best practices, pick up different pages out of different communities of different counties to see what worked, what didn't work. Look at the data, do a data-driven policy in terms of how we want to address it. And I'm really amazed at all these ideas that are coming at us from the youth of our community, which is demonstrating that they are thinking. It's very, very important to express your voice. So send it out to people so that they get to hear what you are thinking of. Let's go to Sean.
Oh, so my question is, what steps can we take to install these independent citizen councils to hold the police accountable? Mr. Hirokawa was talking about that earlier, and I found that to be a very interesting point. So I'm curious, as a regular citizen, how can we get down the road to install these independent citizen councils?
It's your electeds. You have to put pressure on them. Do you have systems in place? Do you have an independent auditor? Some cities in the county do have them, but many of them don't. Sheriff's office, the county board of supervisors just implemented implemented an independent inspector general because of the death of Michael Tyree, but it took him 5 years. But that was a piecemeal now because it's a contract. It's contracting with a law firm in LA that also, I believe, also does Palo Alto PDs. But they're supposed to come up eventually with a new referendum or a new policy in regards to a true citizens independent review panel. But you have to keep pressure on the board of supervisors in regards to that. But you got to remember the sheriff is elected. The board really has no power other than budget maybe over the elected sheriff. But I think if you put enough pressure, those other electeds will put pressure on the sheriff, or you got your city council members, mayors can put pressure if your city doesn't have a true citizens audit. So that would be my suggestion. For me, so I think we're living in a dream area. There isn't that much crime, but why wait for the controversial shooting in this area for why wait for the conjurer? Why wait for that incident to occur? You need those things in place before it happens. And as with, we talked about rioting, you got to have those relationships in place before it happens. And that's just looking forward. I mean, I told you Rodney King, 1991. I mean, you know, gee, I think that you could see at some point it may eventually happen, hopefully not, but you should have those things in place. In that review panel, and see, for me, law enforcement, the unions, they should try to ingratiate that and try to negotiate where they feel that their rights are going to be protected. And somebody had asked about the Police Officers' Bill of Rights and Immunity. That's a Police Officers' Bill of Rights, also known as POBAR. But there's certain, those things were put in place to protect the officers in the street who are being compelled and coerced to give statements against their Fifth Amendment rights. So certain things and other things that went on. But I believe that there can be, based on how we moved forward, there can be a melting, and we could do these things together as a community with law enforcement and your public officials and get it together.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. And I'm seeing if Jim or Jed would like to chime in on this. Well, you know, we are actually, that was the last question. There are a lot more questions, but, you know, I think we have to wrap this up. Otherwise, we'll stay here till midnight because, you know, there's a lot of open items that are popping out that need to be addressed. And this has been a great start, at least for me and hopefully for all of you. And I would love to go around and do a wrap-up statement from each of our panelists. And let's start with Jed, and we'll go to John and then Jim. And let's see how we can wrap this up.
Well, I want to just thank Rishi and Jim and John for all of your excellent ideas put forward, and for everyone who participated, especially those who asked really excellent questions tonight. One thing I just want to ask you to think about when you hang up here, and I'm not giving you homework or anything, but this is just something I hope you'll consider. You know, we have this popular culture notions of what local officials are, like your city council members and your county supervisors. I think it's driven by popular media. You know, we see the show Parks and Rec, and we think it's the people who, you know, just like make the rules for the Little League field and stuff like that. That's totally wrong. It's not just the people who their only job is to do the slurries on the street and set up the rec field. The local elected officials are the ones who touch the most important aspects of your daily life, because they're the ones who oversee your safety. And you should, first of all, learn who your local people are and ask them, what are your positions on things, and on accountability, on training, on due process and procedure. And I guarantee you, I'm sure Jim can and Rishi can vouch for this. The moment you call one of your local people twice, they know who you are. And so reach out to them multiple times and follow up with them. And you would be shocked at a local level how much those phone calls and emails make a difference. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate. And it's an honor to be here and share with you all.
Great,
well, thank you, Jeb, Jim, and Rishi, and for all the questions from the audience. I'll tell you a real quick story here. I was the commander of all of field enforcement for the sheriff's office at one point. There was a high-level African-American person in charge of the Field Enforcement Bureau. He had a poster in his office. That poster showed Charles Manson and an African-American. And then the quote underneath it was, "Who would you stop?" And then I got calls of complaints from rank and file because it was in his office, and it was open cubicle office. So I go down to his office, look around, and I made it well known. I said really loud, "Hey, that's a damn nice poster," and then walked out. And so to have still law enforcement people question what was the value of that poster was kind of eye-opening to me. We had a lot of work to do within the office. And so you just have to remind your public officials, whether you're in California, still have a lot of work to do in regards to bias.
Great. Thanks, John. Jim?
Well, Rishi, I want to thank you and the other panelists, but I also want to thank the young people that came on and asked questions, and the other folks that came on and asked questions. This is really important to have these kinds of discussions. It's so important. The other thing that I wanted to make a note of, Rishi, is this is just not a Black issue. This involves Latinos, it involves Asians, it involves women, it involves the LGBTQ community. You know, so all these people are being looked at under the same microscope in many respects. The important takeaway from all this is be involved. Get involved in your city council meetings, become involved in community organizations, you know, that can be responsive to this. Starts with helping our youth. We need to do whatever we can to build confidence in our young people so that they can grow and become good citizens and become good participants, and so that they have something that they can see a light at the end of their tunnels. Because unfortunately, for a lot of our disadvantaged youth, they don't see that light. And finally, communications is key. You know, bringing together panels like this. The other group that really impresses me is the barbershop group in Oakland, where they bring people from the community in, they bring people, elected representatives, they bring news people in, and they have conversations. And that's where the answers can be found, is in conversations on a local level. And thank you very much, Rishi.
Excellent perspectives. Let's go to Stan. Stan had his hand raised. And Stan, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment here. One of the things I think that I would like to see as a citizen is more deeper investigation on the part of police agencies as to who they hire to start with. You know, I'm thinking about the experience of my own where my wife and I had an extensive interview with the National Security NSA, I guess it was. A friend of ours was doing coding for these guided missiles in one of the big defense contractors. And the guy spent over an hour with us in our living room talking about a lot of stuff. And I'm wondering if maybe we could do more at the front end, spend a little bit more money, spend a little bit more effort at the front end rather than at the back end where we're settling lawsuits and cities are paying out money because, you know, you'll have one bad apple in a group of very good officers, one bad apple will screw up, you know, and see if we could put more effort in on the front end, essentially. That's my comment. It's just a comment that I would like to see that. On the part of cities, and I don't know how we can get through all of the things we've been talking about in this seminar here. There's ways to maybe get through to have that happen.
Thank you for sharing that. Stan is a former mayor of Saratoga, has been a council member for 2 terms, and Jeff Schwartz, earlier I forgot to introduce him properly. He was a West Valley College trustee. So these are members of a community who I respect a lot. And so I do want to thank our panelists here. You know, I think it was a learning experience for me to listen to the experts and understand their perspectives. And just a fantastic dialogue. And what I really liked was the youth engagement. You know, I think they are engaged on this topic, and hopefully this will open up a new world for them in terms of, you know, their understanding of the issues and in terms of how they engage with this world to address these types of challenges. So I see some pretty good things coming out of this one as we try to get through the current crisis with the coronavirus, and also what's going on with everything else around Floyd. So, you know, I would like to end with a quote from Nelson Mandela. You know, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can actually be taught to love as well. Because love comes much more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So this is very key. You know, we have to have a change of culture. We have to have a change of hearts. It comes from education. It comes from legislation. And the answer is all of the above and probably a lot more because we are in a deep soup here. And to get out of it, we'll have to make some drastic choices because we have to end it once and for all. It's not just talk, 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 like many of the politicians do. We have to take action. We have to take actions and we have to hold accountability in our system. And there are too many other issues that we haven't talked about today, which we'll get to at some other day. And like we talk about, these are complex times, and we have everybody in America is saying this is enough. It is time we got together and we said no more. How can we have America that believes in justice for all when we have such blatant prejudice? It is time we changed once and forever. No more precious American lives tragically murdered and lost every year. No more children separated from families, from their fathers forever. Let us make a real difference in changing the systemic racism that is fomented in our society since the very first slaves were brought here almost 400 years ago. And the time is now. Together we can. And yes, we certainly should put all our energies. Now's the time to get through this. And hopefully we'll never look back ever again. So let's make that happen. Thank you to our panelists again. I really appreciate you taking the time. My apologies we ran over. It was excellent conversations. And hopefully we'll reconvene again. The plan is to reconvene not this weekend, but the Sunday after at 2 p.m. We'll bring back a new set of panelists and we'll continue having this conversation. Thank you all for participating today and joining in. Thank you, Suzanne, for chiming in with your question. I really appreciate everybody's insights and perspectives. Thank you all.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the rest of the evening.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.